May 24, 1940. Heinz Guderian stood near Dunkirk with his panzer divisions coiled 10 miles from the coast, and for the first time in the war, he could see the finish line. His tanks had done in 10 days what the German General Staff had refused to promise in 10 years. They had punched through terrain the French had called impassable, crossed the Meuse before the enemy could blink, and outrun their own supply columns, chasing a British and French army that no longer knew which direction was safe. 300,000 men were being squeezed into a shrinking pocket around a single port town. 10 more miles, and there would be nothing left to squeeze. The British Expeditionary Force would cease to exist as a fighting force, and the war in the West might have ended before the summer even began. Then the order came. Halt. It didn't come from a British general who had found a gap in the German line. It didn't come from a staff officer who had spotted a trap waiting in the marshes ahead. It came from Adolf Hitler, overriding the very officers who had built the machine, now grinding to a stop in front of the prize it had chased for a week and a half. Guderian read the order twice. Von Rundstedt, the field marshal who transmitted it, would later insist he had only meant a short pause to let the infantry catch up and consolidate the flanks. Hitler stretched that pause into 3 days. And in those 3 days, the Royal Navy assembled a fleet of nearly 900 vessels, destroyers, ferries, fishing trawlers, private yachts pulled straight out of English harbors, and lifted 338,000 Allied soldiers off the beaches of Dunkirk and back across the Channel. Soldiers who would return 4 years later at Normandy to help burn the Third Reich down to its foundations. This is where the real story of Hitler's downfall begins. Not in the rubble of Berlin in 1945. Not in a concrete bunker with a pistol on the table. It begins here on a beach in northern France, in the exact moment Hitler decided, for the first time, but nowhere near the last, that his own instincts outweighed the judgment of the men who had spent their entire adult lives mastering the science of war. Because that decision was not an isolated mistake. It was the opening note of a pattern that would repeat itself, with mounting cost, at nearly every turning point of the war. A pattern where the German General Staff, arguably the most professionally trained officer corps on the planet, men who had studied Clausewitz and Moltke, who had war-gamed scenarios for decades before a single shot was fired, would present Hitler with sound military logic, and Hitler would override them. Not because he had better information, not because he had superior training, but because he had come to believe, especially after the stunning early victories in Poland and France, that he possessed a kind of intuition that made expertise irrelevant. Generals, in his mind, were cautious by training and cowardly by temperament. He was the visionary who saw what they could not. For a brief, dangerous window, the evidence seemed to support him. France fell in 6 weeks, a campaign the General Staff itself had considered risky, and which Hitler had pushed forward against their hesitation. Poland collapsed in barely a month. Norway and the Low Countries fell in succession. Each victory hardened something in Hitler that would eventually prove fatal. The conviction that when his generals disagreed with him, it was they who were wrong, and it was he who could see the war as it truly was. Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, kept a private diary throughout this period, and its pages chart the slow, corrosive breakdown of trust between the officer corps and their supreme commander. Early entries record professional disagreements handled through ordinary channels, memoranda, briefings, the normal friction of a military bureaucracy. By the middle of the war, the tone shifts entirely. Halder describes Hitler flying into rages when contradicted, dismissing intelligence reports that didn't match his preferred narrative, and increasingly surrounding himself with sycophants who had learned that agreement was safer than accuracy. One entry, written in the tense weeks of 1941, describes the atmosphere in Hitler's headquarters as something closer to a court than a general staff, a place where the wrong facial expression during a briefing could end a career. This is the story of 6 moments. 6 times when Hitler's own generals, men with the training, the battlefield experience, and in several cases the plain common sense to see disaster coming, laid out their objections clearly on the record, before it was too late. And 6 times, Hitler chose his own certainty over their expertise. Dunkirk was the first crack. It would not be the last. What follows is not a story about a madman making random errors. It is something far more unsettling. The story of a leader who won early, believed his own myth completely, and then spent the rest of the war unable to tell the difference between confidence and competence, until the difference cost him an empire, an army, and eventually his own life. To understand why Hitler's generals kept losing these arguments, you have to understand who they actually were. This was not a group of political appointees or party loyalists playing soldier. The German general staff system, refined over nearly a century, was built specifically to prevent the kind of catastrophic individual error that had doomed other armies throughout history. Officers moved through decades of rotating assignments, troop command, staff work, war college, attaché postings, designed to produce commanders who thought in terms of logistics, terrain, timing, and enemy capability rather than personal glory. Heinz Guderian had spent 20 years studying armored warfare before he ever used a tank in anger. Erich von Manstein was considered, even by his enemies, one of the finest operational minds Europe had produced in a generation. Franz Halder had trained an entire generation of staff officers in the discipline of translating political objectives into achievable military plans. These were not men prone to timidity. They were men trained to be right. Hitler, by contrast, had never attended a war college. His military experience consisted of 4 years as a message runner in the First World War, a role that exposed him to danger and to the raw experience of combat, but gave him no exposure to operational planning, logistics, or the coordination of large formations. This mattered less than it should have during the campaigns of 1939 and 1940, for a simple reason. Hitler mostly let his generals run those campaigns. He set the political objective, invade France, and largely deferred to Halder, Brauchitsch, and the general staff on how to achieve it. The Manstein plan that outflanked the French through the Ardennes was, despite later mythology crediting Hitler's genius, primarily the product of Erich von Manstein's persistent lobbying against the more conventional general staff plan that Hitler had initially approved. But something shifted after France fell. Hitler began reading his own propaganda. The victory parades, the newsreels, the adoring crowds, all of it reinforced a narrative in which he alone had seen the path to victory that his cautious generals had missed. He began referring to himself, in private conversations recorded by his aides, as possessing a kind of somnambulistic certainty about military decisions, a phrase that would have alarmed any professional soldier who understood that wars are won through preparation, not sleepwalking confidence. He started interrupting briefings to correct generals on troop dispositions using outdated maps. He began dismissing general staff assessments of Soviet military strength as defeatist propaganda, preferring instead the more flattering intelligence that filtered up through party channels. The invasion of the Soviet Union, launched in June of 1941, initially seemed to vindicate this shift. German forces advanced with staggering speed, encircling entire Soviet armies in the opening weeks, capturing prisoners by the hundreds of thousands. But it was here, deep in Russian territory, barely 2 months into the campaign, that the pattern from Dunkirk would repeat itself on a scale that would ultimately unmake the entire German war effort. And this time, the argument wasn't about a 3-day pause. It was about the single most consequential strategic decision of the entire Eastern Front campaign. By late July 1941, Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group 2 stood roughly 200 miles from Moscow, and every professional soldier in the German High Command understood what that distance meant. The Soviet capital was not merely a symbolic target. It was the central rail and communications hub for the entire western half of the country, the place through which reinforcements, supplies, and command orders had to flow if the Red Army was going to mount any kind of coherent defense. Franz Halder's diary from this period is almost pleading in tone. Take Moscow before winter, before Soviet reserves from Siberia can be brought west, before the German panzer engines that had already covered hundreds of miles of terrible roads begin to fail from mechanical exhaustion. Guderian traveled personally to Hitler's headquarters to make the case face-to-face, laying out maps, casualty projections, and a clear operational argument that every week of delay handed the initiative back to an enemy who desperately needed exactly that kind of gift. Hitler had a different idea. He wanted to divert Guderian's panzers south, away from Moscow entirely, to help encircle Soviet forces defending Ukraine and the industrial and agricultural resources around Kiev. On paper, it wasn't an insane idea. Economic resources mattered, and the resulting encirclement at Kiev would indeed capture over 600,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest single encirclement in the history of warfare. But Guderian, Halder, and Field Marshal von Bock all argued the same point with increasing desperation. Kiev was a battle. Moscow was the war. You could win the battle and still lose the war if the delay cost you the capital before winter arrived. Hitler overruled them all. Guderian's tanks turned south in late August, achieved their spectacular victory at Kiev in September, and then turned back north to resume the drive on Moscow, a diversion that cost roughly 6 critical weeks. 6 weeks that Guderian's own panzer engines, never designed for the primitive road network of rural Russia, could not spare. 6 weeks that allowed the Soviet High Command to begin transferring fresh, winter-equipped divisions from Siberia. Divisions whose presence had been confirmed by Soviet spy Richard Sorg in Tokyo and largely dismissed by German intelligence as unlikely to be committed to the Western Front. By the time German forces resumed the offensive toward Moscow in October, the operation had a new name, Operation Typhoon, and a much narrower window in which to succeed. It advanced with genuine ferocity, reaching the outer suburbs of the city by late November, close enough that German officers reported being able to see the spires of the Kremlin through field glasses. And then the temperature dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms because Hitler had publicly declared the campaign would be finished before winter arrived, began suffering frostbite casualties faster than combat casualties. Panzer engines froze solid overnight. Machine guns jammed from congealed lubricant. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive using precisely the fresh Siberian divisions that 6 weeks of delay had allowed them to position. And the German army, which had never lost a major battle in this war, was thrown backward for the first time. Hitler's response to this first great reversal revealed something important about how he processed failure. Rather than reflecting on whether the Kiev diversion had cost the Wehrmacht its window to take Moscow, he concluded that his generals had simply failed to execute his vision with sufficient will. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, the army's commander-in-chief, suffered what appears to have been a heart attack under the strain and was dismissed in December 1941. Hitler did not appoint a new commander-in-chief of the army. He appointed himself, formally merging the political leadership of the Reich with direct operational control of its ground forces, a decision with no precedent in modern military history, and one that eliminated the last institutional buffer between Hitler's instincts and the battlefield. From this point forward, there was no professional soldier positioned between Hitler and the map table with the authority to say no and make it stick. Guderian himself was relieved of command that same December. Dismissed after a dispute over a tactical withdrawal he had ordered to save his own troops from being encircled during the Soviet counteroffensive. Hitler had issued a standing order forbidding any retreat, anywhere, under any circumstances, a blanket policy that ignored the basic reality that armies sometimes need to trade space for survival. Guderian, watching his men freeze and die in indefensible positions rather than pull back to defensible ones, disobeyed. He was proven tactically correct. He was fired anyway. The message to every remaining general in the Wehrmacht was unambiguous. Professional judgment that contradicted Hitler's stated will, even when that judgment saved German lives, was a firing offense. This is the atmosphere in which the next catastrophe began to take shape. By the summer of 1942, Hitler had set his sights on the southern Soviet Union, the oil fields of the Caucasus, and along the way, a city on the Volga River that carried his rival's name, Stalingrad. The original operational plan, drafted with input from the General Staff, called for a rapid strike to secure the city as a flank guard while the main effort pushed south toward the oil fields. But Hitler became fixated on Stalingrad itself, partly for its strategic value as a transport hub, and partly, according to multiple officers present in his headquarters, for the symbolic value of capturing a city that bore Stalin's name. What began as a supporting operation slowly consumed the entire Southern campaign's resources and attention. By November 1942, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus was fighting house to house inside Stalingrad, grinding down in brutal urban combat that neutralized every advantage German mobile warfare doctrine had ever provided. And then, on November 19th, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer attack against the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies guarding Sixth Army's flanks that German intelligence had flagged as dangerously thin for months. Within 4 days, roughly 250,000 German and Allied soldiers were completely surrounded inside Stalingrad. This was the moment for the pattern to break. Every senior general with a voice in the matter, Chief of the General Staff Kurt Zeitzler, Paulus himself, and eventually even Erich von Manstein, brought in specifically to manage the crisis, argued for the same thing, an immediate breakout. Sixth Army still had enough combat power in late November to fight its way west and link up with relief forces, provided it moved immediately, before Soviet forces could consolidate the encirclement into an impenetrable ring. Every week of delay made the breakout more costly and less likely to succeed. This was not a controversial military opinion. It was the kind of assessment that any competent staff officer, on either side of the war, would have reached independently. Hermann Göring intervened with a promise that would prove fatally seductive to Hitler. The Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, delivering the roughly 500 tons of supplies per day that Sixth Army needed to hold its position, while a relief force fought through to rescue it. Zeitzler did the math immediately and concluded it was operationally impossible. The Luftwaffe simply did not have enough transport aircraft, and winter weather over the southern Russian steppe would ground much of what capacity existed. He was right. Actual daily deliveries over the following weeks averaged closer to 100 tons, barely a fifth of what was needed. And even that thin lifeline shrank further as Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire began shredding the slow, unescorted transport formations. Hitler chose Göring's promise over Zeitzler's math. He ordered Sixth Army to hold its position, forbidding any breakout attempt, and staked the fate of 250,000 men on an airlift that professional Luftwaffe logisticians had already told him was physically impossible to sustain. Manstein assembled a relief force, Operation Winterstorm, and by December 12th had fought to within roughly 30 miles of the Stalingrad pocket, close enough that flares from the relief column were reportedly visible to trapped soldiers on clear nights. Manstein sent word to Paulus, "Break out now, fight west to meet us, and we can save this army." Paulus refused, not out of cowardice, and not entirely out of loyalty. Hitler had issued a direct, explicit order forbidding any withdrawal from Stalingrad under any circumstances, and had personally forbidden Paulus from acting on Manstein's field authorization without Hitler's own confirmation, which never came. By the time it became clear the airlift was failing catastrophically and Manstein's relief column had been forced back by fresh Soviet attacks, the window for a breakout had closed for good. Sixth Army spent the following weeks starving, freezing, and dying in the ruins of a city they could neither hold nor abandon. Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30th, 1943, an unmistakable signal, given that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, intended to push Paulus towards suicide rather than capitulation. Paulus surrendered anyway, the following day. Of the roughly 91,000 German soldiers who went into Soviet captivity at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Stalingrad should have taught a lesson that no general needed repeated. It would be tested again within 6 months at a place that would go down as the largest tank battle in the history of warfare. And once again, the argument that mattered most wasn't fought on the battlefield. It was fought weeks earlier in a briefing room over a question of timing that Hitler's own generals understood far better than he did. In March of 1943, fresh off recapturing the city of Kharkov in a brilliant counterattack, Erich von Manstein saw an opportunity. A massive bulge in the Soviet front line near the city of Kursk sat exposed, its garrison not yet fully dug in, its defenses still incomplete after the chaos of the winter fighting. Manstein's proposal was simple and, by the standards of his own celebrated operational instincts, almost obvious. Attack immediately in April or early May at the latest, while Soviet defenses at Kursk remained thin and German forces still held the initiative from the Kharkov victory. Every week of delay would give the Red Army more time to fortify a salient that intelligence already understood to be strategically vital and defensively vulnerable. Hitler agreed the target was correct. He disagreed entirely on timing. He had become fixated on a new weapon, the Panther tank, rushed into development specifically to counter the Soviet T-34 and promoted by its manufacturers and some of Hitler's advisors as a war-winning technology that could restore German armored superiority in a single stroke. Hitler wanted to wait for enough Panthers to be produced and delivered to the front before launching the attack. Guderian, who by this point had been recalled from retirement to serve as Inspector General of Armor Troops, examined the Panther program in detail and delivered an assessment that history would prove devastatingly accurate. The tank was still riddled with mechanical problems, particularly in its transmission and engine cooling systems, problems that rushed production schedules had not given engineers time to solve. Sending Panthers into combat before these issues were fixed, Guderian argued directly to Hitler's face, would result in tanks breaking down on the way to the battlefield rather than fighting on it. Hitler delayed the offensive anyway, pushing the launch date from May to July, a delay of nearly 2 months. Those 2 months were not spent idle by the Soviet High Command. Soviet intelligence, aided considerably by the British Ultra program, which had been reading German-coded communications for years, had accurate warning of both the location and the general time frame of the coming offensive. Soviet engineers and hundreds of thousands of civilian laborers used the extra weeks to construct one of the most formidable defensive systems ever built. 8 successive defensive belts stretching back nearly 100 miles, laced with an estimated 500,000 landmines, anti-tank ditches, and pre-registered artillery positions, covering every conceivable avenue of German advance. When Operation Citadel finally launched on July 5, 1943, the results validated every warning Guderian had given. Of the roughly 200 Panther tanks committed to the southern attack sector, a significant portion suffered mechanical breakdowns before even reaching Soviet lines, engine fires, transmission failures, mobility losses that had nothing to do with enemy action and everything to do with a rushed production timeline that impatience had demanded and mechanics had warned against. The tanks that did reach the battlefield drove into defensive works that simply had not existed 2 months earlier, works built during precisely the delay Hitler had insisted upon to wait for those same unreliable tanks. The battle ground on for over a week, culminating in the massive armored engagement near the village of Prokhorovka, where hundreds of tanks fought at close range in a chaotic, smoke-choke battle that both sides would later mythologize in different directions. And then, on July 13th, with the battle still raging and its outcome genuinely uncertain, Hitler abruptly ordered the operation halted, not because his generals had convinced him it was failing, but because Allied forces had landed in Sicily 4 days earlier, and Hitler wanted to redirect forces to the Mediterranean theater. Manstein, who believed his forces in the southern sector had finally broken through and could still achieve a meaningful operational victory if allowed to continue, argued furiously against the cancellation. He was overruled again. Kursk represented something beyond a lost battle. It was the last time in the war that Germany would hold the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, the last time German commanders would get to choose where and when a major offensive would occur, rather than reacting to Soviet ones. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would spend the remainder of the war retreating, and every retreat would reopen the same argument that had killed an army at Stalingrad. Professional soldiers requesting the operational flexibility to trade space for survival, and Hitler, increasingly isolated in his headquarters and increasingly convinced that willpower could substitute for logistics, refusing to let them. By the time Erwin Rommel took command of Army Group B in early 1944, tasked with defending the French coastline against an Allied invasion that every intelligence officer in Europe knew was coming, he had already drawn a hard lesson from watching German air power dominate North Africa's early campaigns before Allied numbers eventually crushed his forces there. Whoever controlled the beaches in the first 24 hours of an amphibious landing would win the entire battle. Rommel believed the panzer divisions defending France needed to be stationed close to the coastline itself, ready to counterattack an Allied beachhead within hours of the first landing craft touching sand, before the invaders could establish the kind of secure foothold that Allied naval gunfire and air superiority would make nearly impossible to dislodge afterward. Gerd von Rundstedt, the aging field marshal serving as overall commander in the West, along with the armored specialist Leo Gehr von Schweppenberg, saw it differently, and their reasoning, rooted in decades of studying mobile warfare, was equally sound. They argued the panzer divisions should be held well back from the coast, concentrated as a powerful mobile reserve, so that once Allied intentions became clear, since no one could be certain in advance whether the main invasion would land in Normandy, Calais, or somewhere else entirely, German armor could converge in overwhelming, concentrated force against the real target, rather than being scattered thinly along hundreds of miles of coastline defending against a landing that might never come to that particular stretch of sand. Both arguments had genuine merit, and both men had the professional standing to make them. This was exactly the kind of high-stakes operational question that the German General Staff system had been built over generations to resolve through rigorous analysis and a clear chain of command capable of committing fully to one plan or the other. Instead, Hitler split the difference in the worst possible way. Rather than choosing decisively between Rommel's forward defense doctrine and Rundstedt's centralized reserve doctrine, he divided the panzer divisions between the two competing plans, satisfying neither general's operational logic, and then made the situation catastrophically worse by declaring that several of the most powerful panzer divisions could not be moved into action at all without his own personal authorization, regardless of what was actually happening on the ground in France. This single administrative decision would prove to be one of the most consequential of the entire war. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed ashore at 5 beaches across the Normandy coast, the German officers, who could see exactly what was unfolding, lacked the authority to release the armored reserves that might have crushed the beachhead in its first, most vulnerable hours. Hitler was asleep. According to multiple accounts from officers present at his headquarters that morning, his personal staff was afraid to wake him, uncertain whether this landing represented the genuine main invasion or merely an elaborate diversion, a fear Allied deception operations had deliberately cultivated for months, specifically to produce this kind of paralysis. By the time Hitler woke, received his briefing, and finally authorized the release of the panzer reserves, it was early afternoon. The Allies had spent the entire morning consolidating their positions on the beaches, unopposed by the concentrated armored counterattack that might have thrown them back into the sea. Rommel himself was 300 miles away in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, having been told by his own meteorologists, correctly, for typical conditions, that the rough Channel weather made an Allied landing extremely unlikely in early June. He raced back to France as soon as he received word of the landings, but by then the most critical window had already closed. He would later tell his staff, with the bitter clarity of a professional watching his own warnings validated too late to matter, that the battle for France would be won or lost in the first 24 hours, and that those 24 hours had already been lost, not to Allied strength, but to a chain of command too tangled and too centralized around one man's personal authorization to react at the speed the moment demanded. The fighting in Normandy ground on for weeks after that, brutal and costly for both sides. But the strategic outcome had effectively been decided in those lost morning hours. By August, Allied forces had broken out of the Normandy beachhead entirely, and the German army in France was in headlong retreat toward its own border, a retreat that Hitler's standing orders against withdrawal made even more costly than it needed to be, trapping tens of thousands of German soldiers in pockets that skilled tactical retreats could have saved for the defense of Germany itself. 6 weeks after the Normandy landings, on July 20th, 1944, a bomb hidden in a briefcase exploded inside a conference room at Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, acting on behalf of a conspiracy of military officers who had concluded that Hitler's leadership was leading Germany to certain destruction, had planted it personally before flying back toward Berlin to help coordinate a coup. Hitler survived, protected by little more than the heavy oak table leg that happened to stand between his legs and the blast. The conspiracy collapsed within hours. What followed was not merely the execution of the plotters, though nearly 5,000 people were eventually killed in the purges that followed, many of them with only tangential or entirely fabricated connections to the actual plot. What followed was the final, complete destruction of whatever remained of the professional relationship between Hitler and his officer corps. Hitler had always harbored suspicion toward the aristocratic, professionally trained general staff officers who populated the upper ranks of the Wehrmacht, men whose class background and independent professional judgment had never fully aligned with National Socialist ideology. The July plot confirmed his deepest paranoia. From this point forward, the Nazi salute replaced the traditional military salute throughout the armed forces, a symbolic loyalty test applied literally millions of times a day. Promotions increasingly favored ideological reliability over demonstrated competence. Officers learned, with brutal clarity, that questioning Hitler's judgment was no longer merely a career risk. It could be a capital offense. It was into this atmosphere of terror and enforced conformity that Hitler introduced his final major offensive gamble of the war, a massive counterattack through the Ardennes forest, the same terrain his panzers had exploited so brilliantly in 1940, aimed at driving all the way to the port of Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies in the West in two. When Hitler first presented this plan to his senior commanders in the autumn of 1944, the reaction from experienced field officers was close to unanimous, and unusually blunt given the climate of fear that now pervaded every headquarters in the Reich. Field Marshal Walter Model, an officer known for aggressive tactics and no particular reputation for timidity, reportedly called the plan's objectives unrealistic from the moment he saw them, given the fuel shortages plaguing every panzer unit in the German army and the near-total Allied air superiority over Western Europe that made large-scale daylight movement of armor a fatal proposition. Gerd von Rundstedt, restored to nominal command in the West, considered the plan's ambitious objectives so detached from Germany's actual remaining resources that he privately referred to it, according to officers on his staff, as something considerably less flattering than a serious military operation. Both men proposed a scaled-back alternative, a more limited attack with achievable objectives that might inflict real damage on Allied forces without gambling the last significant reserves of German armor on a 400-mile drive to a heavily defended port city. Hitler rejected the scaled-back alternative outright. He had convinced himself, largely in isolation from the sober logistical assessments his own quartermasters were providing, that a single dramatic victory in the West could fracture the American-British alliance and force a negotiated peace that would let him then turn his full remaining strength against the Soviets in the East. It was in almost every particular a fantasy detached from the actual military balance of December 1944, a Germany with a fraction of the fuel reserves the operation required, facing an enemy with total command of the skies and manufacturing capacity that dwarfed anything the Reich could still produce. Model and Rundstedt, forced to comply with a direct order in an environment where refusal now carried lethal consequences, executed the plan they had explicitly warned against. The offensive launched on December 16, 1944, catching Allied forces genuinely off guard and achieving significant early gains through the same forested terrain that had worked so well for years earlier. But the fuel shortages Model had warned about materialized almost exactly as predicted. German panzer columns began running dry in the field within days, forced to seize American fuel depots that mostly turned out to be empty or already destroyed, immobilizing tanks that then became sitting targets the moment weather cleared enough for Allied aircraft to return to the skies. By late January 1945, the offensive had consumed the last significant reserves of German armor and fuel on the Western Front, resources that could not be replaced, and that would be desperately needed for the defense of Germany itself in the following months. The gamble that Model and Rundstedt had warned against in the clearest possible terms, in the presence of a leader who now treated disagreement as disloyalty, had cost Germany the last military assets that might have meaningfully slowed the Allied advance into the Reich's own territory. By the spring of 1945, the pattern that had begun at Dunkirk 5 years earlier had run its full, terrible course. Hitler, now directing the defense of Germany itself from a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, continued issuing orders to divisions that in many cases no longer existed, except on the maps his aides still moved across the table in front of him. He demanded counterattacks from formations that had been reduced to a few hundred exhausted men. He forbade retreats from positions that had already been overrun. General Heinrich, tasked with defending Berlin's eastern approaches along the Oder River in the war's final weeks, quietly ignored several of Hitler's more suicidal tactical demands, pulling his forces back from an exposed forward line just hours before a massive Soviet artillery bombardment would have annihilated them. One of the last examples of a German general choosing battlefield reality over Hitler's insistence, and one of the very few, by that point, still in a position to make that choice and survive it. The consistent thread connecting Dunkirk, Kiev, Stalingrad, Kursk, Normandy, and the Ardennes is not simply that Hitler made 6 bad decisions among many good ones. It's that in every single one of these cases, the professional military judgment available to him, for men whose entire careers had been built on exactly this kind of analysis, pointed toward a different course of action, one that history has generally vindicated as sounder than the path Hitler actually chose. Guderian was right about Moscow. Zeitzler was right about the airlift. Guderian was right about the Panthers. Rommel was right about the beaches. Model and Rundstedt were right about the Ardennes fuel shortage. These were not close calls decided by hindsight. In nearly every case, the general's objections were documented in real time, before the outcome was known, by men risking their careers and sometimes their lives to say so. What makes this pattern more than a simple catalog of stubbornness is the mechanism that sustained it. Early victories in Poland and France convinced Hitler that his instincts were superior to professional training, a belief that might have remained a harmless personal delusion had he not also possessed absolute, unchallengeable authority over an army of millions of men. Each subsequent disagreement was filtered through that belief. When his generals were proven right, as at Dunkirk and Kiev, he did not update his confidence in their judgment. He concluded instead that they had failed to execute his vision with sufficient conviction, and he removed them. Brauchitsch, Guderian, Halder, Rundstedt himself was dismissed and reinstated multiple times, replacing experienced commanders with officers more inclined toward unquestioning compliance. The pool of men both willing and able to challenge him shrank with every passing year, and the July 20th assassination attempt in 1944 finished the process entirely, transforming professional disagreement from a career risk into a potentially lethal one. This is, in the end, a story about what happens when confidence stops being calibrated by outcomes. A leader can be wrong once and learn from it. He can be wrong twice and grow cautious. But a leader who is proven wrong repeatedly by the same class of experts, using the same category of reasoning, and responds each time not by adjusting his confidence downward, but by removing the people who tried to warn him, that leader is not simply making mistakes. He is systematically dismantling the one mechanism that might have corrected his mistakes before they became irreversible. Every general Hitler fired for being right took a piece of institutional memory and professional judgment with him, and every replacement understood, with increasing clarity, exactly what kind of answer their new position required. Germany did not lose the Second World War purely because of Allied industrial capacity, though that mattered enormously. It did not lose purely because of the sheer size of the Soviet Union, though that mattered too. It lost in significant part because the single most powerful decision-making authority in the entire war became progressively less connected to military reality with every year that passed, at the exact moment when the stakes of every individual decision were rising toward the catastrophic. The generals who built the Wehrmacht into the most feared fighting force in Europe were, one by one, silenced, dismissed, or simply overruled by the man they had sworn to serve. And Germany paid for every single one of those silences in soldiers, in cities, and ultimately in the complete and total destruction of the nation Hitler had promised to make invincible. There is a particular kind of tragedy in watching genuine expertise fail to save something, not because the expertise was wrong, but because the person holding ultimate authority had stopped being capable of hearing it. Guderian, Manstein, Zeitzler, Rommel model. These were not men who lacked the answers. They had the answers in writing, delivered on time, argued with the full weight of their professional reputations behind them. What Germany lacked, at the moment it needed it most, was a leader capable of recognizing that the men who disagreed with him were not his enemies. They were the only people left in the entire Reich still willing to tell him the truth.